So, you guys seem to really love the videos about the UK and its road network. I think as British people, we just love to moan at things, really, and I'm all here for it at the end of the day. But when it comes to the UK roads, there's a lot of complaints, things like potholes, things like traffic, but the size of the roads is something that I have more than alluded to in the past. I have spoken at length about it, but I haven't really gone in depth and answered the question, why are the UK's roads so narrow? Well, there's a few reasons for this. Now, when people pose this question, they normally are American or from a country where the road network and indeed the entire nation is a lot younger. Now, that is a key difference for me. That is one of the biggest reasons for why the UK's roads are narrow. And there's other factors as well, of course, which I'm going to get into. Cars getting bigger, I think, is a big factor behind that too, of course. But let's just talk about the road network itself. Why are the roads in the UK in general more narrow than certain countries, such as the United States? Well, it's because our roads are a lot older. Now, the modern UK road network basically got a massive revamp starting in the 1960s when the motorway started to come in, and that ran all the way till about the late 80s or so. By the late 80s, you had most of what is now the motorway network in place in the UK. That basically consisted of either building partly new motorways or revamping and improving already existing ones. And back then, the cars in the United Kingdom in the 1960s were tiny. They were so small. I mean, for example, the most sold, the most popular car in the history of the United Kingdom is the Mini Cooper. Now, I'm not talking about the modern day Mini Cooper that's made by BMW. I'm talking about the original Mini Cooper, which if anybody has seen them, and you still see quite a few going around to be fair, they're tiny. I don't even know if I'd get in one of them. They are as small as the smallest clown car that you can imagine. Good cars, not insulting them, but small they very much are. So yeah, that kind of gives you an idea. Even vans, I mean, anybody who's seen the show Only Fools and Horses will know about the Reliant Robin van that Del Boy has. I mean, that was considered a van. The thing is tiny. It's like half the size of a modern day hatchback. It's about a quarter of the size of a modern day SUV. So when these roads were being designed and revamped, they were designed to accommodate cars that were a lot smaller. Yes, of course, things like trucks were bigger, but even trucks back then were tiny compared to what they are now. Again, a quarter, a fifth of the size of what cars are nowadays. Sorry, what lorries are nowadays in the UK. So that's a big reason why. Meanwhile, in the United States, a bit earlier than us to be fair, but they had the highway system going from the 1950s. And cars back in the 1950s in America were huge. They were massive. Have you seen one of those in the UK? Again, it's rare, but you see it and they look so out of place because they're huge. Yes, modern day cars are massive as well, probably bigger than even those. And we're going to get onto that. But when those roads were being designed in the United States, they were basically designed around those cars. Their trucks, their cars, they don't really have vans over there, at least they didn't back then anyway. They were a lot bigger, so their highways and stuff were built to be larger to accommodate those cars. Everything is bigger in Texas, and it also applies to the whole US when it comes to cars as well. So that's a big reason. The other reason as well is because basically the UK's roads have been around for even longer than what I just said. The routes themselves, things like the A1 in the UK, that has been around since Roman times. That was known as the Great North Road, and it ran from what was then the capital of Colchester near London to York, not too far from where I live in Yorkshire. So that's another reason as well. Those routes have been there for hundreds if not thousands of years. And if you go down country lanes, for example, those haven't been touched in hundreds of years. Those will barely fit one car going wide. And anybody who's driven, I absolutely would recommend it, by the way. Anybody who's driven routes such as the NC 500, the North Coast 500 in Scotland, which I have, will know that that route is one, absolutely breathtaking, but two, it's single track for the most part, which basically means there is one lane. Not one lane, I don't mean one lane either side, I mean one lane. It's one path. And there's a lot of country lanes in England and other parts of the UK as well that are like that, but that's a main route in Scotland, albeit a very remote one, but one that is used a lot by tourists such as myself at that time. So there is that too, there's the country lane thing. And don't get me wrong, there will be some narrow roads in the US, I am sure there are, particularly over in the east of the country, which was colonised first by the Europeans, where there will be some older routes. I mean, for example, let's get on to Australia. Let's just talk about that very briefly. My good friend who runs the Chronicle group with me, Jared, he's from Australia, and he spent a lot of times in, I think it's Sydney, he says, which was the first city colonised by Europeans in the late 1700s, I believe it was. And he says that's basically like a European city in terms of how it's laid out. It's very difficult to drive around. The rest of Australia, for the most part, is absolutely fine. It's no problem because it's a lot newer. And that's another key part of it as well. But we have to talk about the cars, because it's all right saying that, roads in the UK are narrower, because they are, than a lot of other countries. But the cars are another big factor too. Before I get onto that, let me just touch on something else as well. It's not just the UK that is the worst offender here. There are countries where roads are even narrower. It's particularly here in Europe. Look at Italy, look at France. I've heard things about their roads being a lot more difficult to navigate because they're a lot narrower as well. So there are some countries where the roads are actually quote unquote worse for that. And again, it's reflected in the cars. You look at some of the tiny cars that Italy's produced, the Fiat 500, France with its Citroën 2CV, for example, and the Renault Clio, a hugely popular car in the UK, but also in France too. Tiny cars back in the day. But back in the day is different to now. What's the problem now? Well, cars have got a lot bigger. Cars have got a lot bigger. And again, this is something that has caused controversy in the comments section when I've been talking about this. I've stated the fact that cars have got larger, particularly over the last 20 years or so, 10 years in particular. Now, why is this? Why are cars getting bigger? Shouldn't they be getting smaller? Because, we're trying to be more fuel economic when it comes to fuel. That's what I'm trying to say. There we go. But no, cars have actually got larger. And there's several reasons for this. Again, the two main factors really for me, and again, I'm sure some people will disagree, some people will not agree with this, but for me, I think it's pretty clear that the two reasons for this are because of safety improvements and also because of the technology in cars too, which does lead into the safety as well. Cars now are much safer than they used to be. And that's just a fact. You get in an old car nowadays, you almost feel a bit exposed. You're that close to the side of the outside of the door that you've got in, and you're so close to the ground as well. Things like airbags have come in, things like extra protection, just generally for people when it comes to these accidents. And then the technology comes in as well. All the collision avoidance, all the Bluetooth, the sat navs, the consoles, the telemetry data. This is stuff that you just didn't get even 10 years ago. Getting in a car that's 10 years old now, the difference is so stark, it's unbelievable. Whereas if you get in a car from the 90s to the 80s, for example, yeah, it's different, but it's not a huge amount. But if you get in a car from 2014, 2013 now, you feel ancient because the technology has moved on so much. People are demanding more and more perks in their cars. People want to buy these cars because they've got so many devices. They've got Apple CarPlay and Android Auto or whatever. You didn't care about that stuff before, but car manufacturers want to have that in their cars to sell it, because it makes them more valuable, it makes them more profitable, it makes them more desirable. And this isn't having to go at car manufacturers, they're just supplying the demand. Simple as that. They've always got to one-up each other. Maybe their engine's not as good, but hey, you've got these little technological perks in the car, which your rivals don't have. So that's the reason too. Now, people might say, well, they're just doing this unnecessarily. Like, why do you need to have all this technology in the car? But again, it's supply and demand. It's how much they can actually fit into their car, and it's about supporting the brand in that sense. And then some people might say, well, wait a minute. Why do I need to have all this space being used up in my car? I've got a mobile phone that's way easier and more powerful to use when it comes to the tech than my actual car. What is going on here? Well, again, it's cost saving. It's cost saving because car manufacturers could absolutely make cars far smaller than what they used to be, what they are currently, if they just reduced the size of the technology that's actually being used in those cars. But it would cost more. If you make things smaller and more compact, it's more expensive. That's just the way it is. And the same could be true of the safety devices too, but A, they don't want to compromise the safety of their car, and B, again, it would cost more. So there is that as well. So cars have got bigger, they're going to continue to get bigger. Maybe we'll reach a point where the space in the cars is more efficient. They eventually get smaller. I mean, we've seen this sort of things with mobile phones, for example. They started out massive, then they got tiny, and now we have smartphones which are just getting bigger and bigger. And I hate them, to be honest. I hate big phones. I've got a Samsung, and it's it's not that big at all really, but there's some people who have mobile phones that are too big for the pocket. And that's a good analogy really when it comes to this. Your jeans pockets, for example, they haven't changed size. The overall size of the roads and the width of the roads in the UK have not changed. The cars have got bigger. Your mobile phones got bigger. That's what's changed. So the roads, when they were constructed in the UK, when back in the day when it was just horse and cart, they were absolutely fine. Then when they were revamped in the 1960s, the cars and lorries were much smaller. They were absolutely fine. Now the cars are getting bigger and it's causing problems. It's making it really tricky. I mean, for example, they're still doing this with brand new roads. Well, it's not just existing roads that are the problem. Where I live, on my estate, it's a brand new estate, it was built about 5 years ago or so. The roads are very narrow. Now, I know why they've done this. They've used it to maximise the amount of space that each property can have, and I'm grateful for that. I'm grateful that I've got a bigger garden, for example. But the downside of that is that the roads are narrow. And again, the final point I'm going to make is that they can't just go widening the roads. This is what a lot of people might say. Why don't you just increase the size of the roads then? The cars aren't going to get smaller. The problem is there's existing infrastructure and houses and buildings already there. You can't go just demolishing people's houses just to make the roads 6 inches bigger on each side just because the cars are getting bigger. Those people have got to live. For example, where I live, or where I used to live in an area called Marsh in Huddersfield, and the main road of Marsh was basically one that led directly onto the M62, so you can imagine how bad the traffic is. That road is an absolute nightmare to navigate because it's so narrow. It takes an unbelievable amount of traffic on it every day. But they can't widen it because it's got lines of houses, people's businesses, people's livelihoods on either side. You can't just go demolishing that. It is a very, very marginal gain in terms of comfort for that road, in terms of safety for that road perhaps, but you're doing millions in damage doing it. So it's just cost effective wise, it is not even in the conversation. It would be a disaster, so even consider it. So yeah, there we go, guys. Roads in the UK, they're not the smallest around. They're pretty small for modern day cars, but when they were originally revamped in the 1960s, they were fit for purpose. Now though, arguably not as much. Cars have gotten bigger and that's had a massive effect on it. And we see that with things like potholes too. There's more potholes on the UK roads than ever before, and it's only getting worse. So yes, a much longer video for you guys, of course. I hope you enjoyed that. Those are my thoughts on it. Give us your opinions in the comments below. I've tried to cover all angles with this because, I'm not coming out here and saying it's one person's fault, one company's fault, the UK government's fault or whatever. There's a lot of different factors in here that have contributed to it, and it's all come about in the last 20 years or so. This was not a conversation that people were having in the early 2000s, really. Cars were not as big, the roads were fit for purpose. Now the cars are bigger, and the roads are not fit for purpose anymore. But what are your thoughts in the comments below, guys? Let us know. Like, share, comment, subscribe, ring the bell, and we'll see you very soon here on themotoringchronicle.com. Have a good one, guys.